Have you ever wondered about the vegetables our medieval ancestors once grew? Those forgotten roots and greens that vanished from our tables long ago. Tonight, I'll take you on a journey to uncover these lost treasures of the soil and why they just might need to come back to our gardens and kitchens. Ready to rediscover a world buried beneath time? Let's begin. Come closer, child. The hearth is warm and the night is kind. Let me tell you a tale, not of knights or dragons, but of seeds and soil, of forgotten greens that once graced the tables of kings and commoners alike. It is a tale most old, plucked from the loam of time itself, where roots whisper secrets to those who listen. Long ago, when the moon still shone golden and the stars watched over each furrowed field, there lay a quiet village called Elder Vale. Tucked between the forest of hollow oaks and the river Brindle, the folk of Elder Vale were not warriors nor wizards, but stewards of the earth, farmers of fine instinct and fierce love for the land. These farmers knew plants you've never tasted, nor seen in market or book. They knew skirret, sweet as honeyed turnip. They knew purslane, crisp with summer dew. They knew alexanders, tall and bold, and rampion, whose leaves made a stew that warmed even the coldest bellies. And in that village, among these caretakers of crop and clod, there lived a young girl named Willa, small of frame but vast of heart. Willa had the curious eyes of someone who listened to the wind and believed that plants might speak back. Each morning before dawn she rose barefoot and wandered to the garden of her grandmother, Marith, the village's oldest grower, whose silver hair was bound with ivy leaves and whose fingernails always bore the scent of thyme and loam. "Child," Marith would say, "there sips more to life than barley and cabbage. The old crops, the forgotten ones, they sip to the soul of our soil." Willa would nod and follow her grandmother through rows of ancient vegetables. Their names almost spells Scorzonera, Krosna, and Good King Henry, and though her belly rumbled for oatcake and honey, she listened well and remembered. For Marith said that each plant had a tale, and each tale held a wisdom. "Skirret fed the pilgrims," she whispered once as she pulled its many roots from the soil like a tangled braid. "Sweet and long-lasting, could stay fresh the whole of winter. Its sip's been lost to laziness, child, and the sweetness of it too." "Why did people forget?" Willa asked. "Oh, because the world got fast and folk got proud," Marith muttered. "They bred for yield, not taste. Left behind what didn't set fit into carts bound for big cities." And so in Elder Vale a secret was kept, one of flavour and history buried in dark soil and tender hands. But change was blowing, child. The kind of change that uproots more than turnips. And that, I fear, is where our tale begins. The wind that stirred the leaves of Elder Vale that autumn was not like the usual whisper of the season. It carried with it the scent of distant fires and strange perfumes, and it hummed low with the sound of hooves, many hooves, pounding the far roads. Willa, always listening, heard it before the others did. She lay awake in her loft bed, staring at the thatched ceiling, hearing the trees groan and the ground shift beneath the weight of what approached. The next morning she ran to her grandmother's plot before even the rooster crowed. Marith was already there, kneeling by a clump of what looked like long, slender dandelions with deep blue-green leaves. "You hear it too, don't you?" Willa said. "Aye," Marith answered, brushing soil from her palms. "Change rides fast these days, too fast for roots to hold." She stood slowly, bones creaking, and looked toward the hills beyond the fields. Merchants, nobles, travelling cooks, they pass through with new seeds, strange fruits and foreign vegetables. They dazzle the folk with red tomatoes and great orange pumpkins. What do they care for Good King Henry or Chervil root? Willa frowned. But the old plants, they belong here. They grow without fuss. They last. They belong, yes, but they sipped no voice in a world full of shouters, Marith said, rubbing her back. "Come, girl, let sips gather the Scorzonera before it flowers. Once it bolts, the root turns bitter." Together they dug carefully into the soil. The root, black as ink on the outside, white and creamy within, emerged like a wand from the earth. Willa loved the smell of it. Sharp, sweet, mysterious. "Do you remember the first one we grew together?" she asked, smiling. "I do," said Marith. "You thought it was a stick and tried to feed it to a squirrel." They both laughed. It was a small, soft sound, lost in the wind. But that day, as they harvested the old plants, a thunder of hooves came rolling down the road to Elder Vale. Not war horses, thank the saints, but wagon teams, big ones, bearing banners of silk and paint. At their head rode a man in velvet robes, his boots polished and his beard oiled. He called himself Lord Cernuin, envoy of the royal pantry, and he brought with him edicts and changes. A competition, he declared in the town square, unfurling a scroll longer than the baker sip's table. The crown seeks the finest vegetable grown in all the land. The winner shall supply the royal table for a year, and be named keeper of the king sip's crop. The crowd gasped. The smith cheered. The innkeeper rubbed his hands together, already dreaming of fat purses. Willa looked at Marith. We should enter, she whispered. But Marith Sip's face was like bark. They one sit want what we grow, she said, not the old ones. Then we still show them why they should. The older woman didn't answer. She merely turned back toward her garden. Yet in the soil that night, Willa planted with purpose. Skirret, rampion, sea beet, salsify, even the tender little roots of cross, no bigger than the curl of a baby's finger. She whispered to each as her grandmother had taught her, and in her heart she made a vow. If the world had forgotten these vegetables, then she, Willa of Elder Vale, would make them remember, and not with words but with taste. The days that followed were filled with a quiet urgency, while other villagers rushed to plant the new and fashionable crops, dazzling red peppers from the southern isles, squat golden squashes, even a rumoured purple bean from the far eastern coast. Willa remained among her grandmother's rows of humble green. Each morning, before the sun had dried the dew from the wild nettle, she was in the soil, hands dirty, hair tangled, whispering encouragement to each root and leaf. Though her fingers ached and her knees wore through her skirts, she tended each bed with love and care unmatched by any field in Elder Vale. The Scorzonera was the first to speak back, not in words, of course, but in a manner Marith had taught her to feel rather than hear. The leaves stood straighter, the earth stayed soft around the root, and when Willa dug a test sample, the white flesh within was milky and sweet, with a scent like warm almond. She smiled to herself, setting the root gently back into place. Rampion grew quietly beside it, tender leaves fanning out like the skirts of a noblewoman at dance. Willa would often stroke the leaves as she passed, murmuring tales of old, of how knights once sought rampion to keep their strength, and how mothers brewed it in stews to protect their children from winter's chill. These were vegetables with stories, and stories Willa believed had power. Around her, the village pulsed with competition. Farmers shouted over fence posts about whose crop grew fastest, whose tomato plant had the shiniest skin, whose beans had the most pods per stalk. Some mocked Willa, though not cruelly. "Still growing weeds, girl," barked old Thurgan, a broad-shouldered man who planted nothing that couldn't be sold by weight. "Not weeds," Willa replied, brushing crosson from her apron. "Heritage." He laughed. "Heritage done stepped. Feed a kingdom, but good luck, little mouse." Marith said nothing during these days, though Willa often caught her watching from the shadow of her thatched porch. Her eyes, once as sharp as hawks, had grown weary. The world was changing, and even the strongest roots could not hold against a flood forever. Then came the visit. Lord Cernuin returned, this time on foot, wearing a coat the colour of red wine and boots laced with silver thread. Behind him trudged a scribe, a cook in white linen, and a gardener from the palace. Judging, tasting, measuring. They went from farm to farm, biting into blanched turnips and slicing open imported melons. Every visit ended in a polite nod, a few scribbled notes, and the promise of consideration. When at last they arrived at Willa's plot, the other villagers gathered, curious whether the weeds would even be tasted. Cernuin frowned when he saw the patch. "You've grown, Skirret," he said, squinting at the tangled roots. "Yes, my lord," Willa said, dipping a respectful curtsy, "and Scorzonera and Salsify. And these are no longer in common rotation," the scribe interrupted. "But they were once," Willa said, voice strong, "and I think they should be again." The palace cook raised a brow, reached out and plucked a piece of Scorzonera. He sniffed it, nibbled and paused. "Cooked. It might be something," he said. "Then let me cook it for you," Willa said quickly. The cook glanced at Cernuin. "You still not find better flavour in a single tomato, I wager?" Cernuin raised his hand, silencing the gathering murmurs. "Very well, one dish. You still have until sundown." Willa Sip's heart leapt, and then dropped into her boots. Sundown was only hours away, and her hearth was small, her larder meagre, but she nodded. "I sit or make do." She raced back to the cottage. Marith was at the hearth, stirring a pot of barley. "I need your help," Willa panted. Marith's hands stilled. "I thought you stipped ask." Without another word, the old woman reached beneath the bench and pulled out a leather-bound book, stained with broth, crinkled with time. "The Feast of Forgotten," she whispered. "Recipes from my grandmother, Sip's grandmother. We said'll give them something to remember." And so, as the sun began to tilt westward, 2 women, one young, one old, began to cook. Not for gold, not for title, but for the memory of vegetables too noble to be lost. The town square of Elder Vale had been transformed by sunset. Long trestle tables lined the cobbled courtyard, draped in linen and scattered with the fruits of ambition. Candles flickered in jars, casting soft light on rows of glazed vegetables, sugared gourds, towered tarts, and rare fruits with colours so vibrant they looked painted. Villagers moved nervously between their stations, adjusting garnishes, brushing stray crumbs from plates, stealing glances at their neighbours' entries with a mixture of admiration and envy. And at the far end of it all, beneath a painted banner bearing the royal crest, a golden sheaf of wheat crossed with a silver spoon, stood Lord Cernwin, his gloved hands folded behind his back, and beside him the royal taster, his brow knit in concentration. Will arrived quietly, her pie warm beneath the cloth, the scent rising like a prayer. She stepped up to the final open spot at the table, a small, plain section of board with no silver tray, no carved serving utensils, no embroidered napkins. Just her, the pie, and a humble wooden plate carved by her uncle years ago. She set the pie down and uncovered it. And for a moment, just a blink, the sounds of the square seemed to hush. The golden crust glistened, laced with syrup-dark swirls. Steam curled upward in lazy spirals. Even the cook from the royal entourage leaned forward, nostrils flaring slightly. Marith had said the aroma would be the first soldier through the gates, and she was right. Still, none spoke to her. None applauded. There were no marvels or murmurs, just the usual doubts clinging like thistle burrs. Willa folded her hands behind her back and waited, eyes steady. The judging began with ceremony. Each contestant stood as their dish was presented. The scribe read the names and ingredients aloud. As was custom, Cernwin would raise a brow or nod politely. The royal taster sampled each dish, chewing slowly, whispering notes to the cook beside him, who scribbled observations in a worn journal. Sweet carrot custards, creamed pumpkin folded with ginger, a rare fruit from the Southlands that bled red juice when cut, and from Thurgan the Braggart, a monstrous tomato the size of a child's head, sliced and served with soft cheese and wild salt. Applause rippled for some dishes. A few, especially those drenched in exotic spice or boasting foreign pedigree, drew low hums of approval. Willa waited. Her pie remained untouched, unnoticed at the end of the line, until, at last, they reached her. The scribe cleared his throat. Final entry, from Willa, daughter of Bran the Cooper. Disheroots pie of skirret rampion, salsify with elderflower glaze. There was a brief pause. Someone in the crowd stifled a chuckle. The taster looked down. He blinked. He had clearly never heard of half those ingredients, but duty was duty. He cut a small wedge with a worn silver knife, and the crust crackled delicately beneath the blade. A stream of fragrant steam spilled out. He paused again, inhaled. Then he took a bite. The change was subtle, but Willa saw it. His chewing slowed, his posture relaxed slightly. The cook beside him looked up from his notes and raised an eyebrow. Without a word, the taster took another bite, then a third. Cernwin stepped forward. "Is it too rich?" "No," the taster said simply. "It tastes like something I sit known but never eaten, like memory." There was a murmur through the crowd. The cook took a slice and sampled it. His eyes closed. "It sits layered," he said. "Sweet, but not sugary. The skirret. It sings under the rampion. And the elderflower, saints above, that glaze. It tastes like an orchard at the end of summer," the taster said softly. Willa stood motionless. She dared not smile, not yet. She dared not look to Marith, who stood at the edge of the square leaning on her walking stick. Cernwin held up a gloved hand. "You say these ingredients were once common?" Willa nodded. Very. They grow here with no trouble. No hothouses. No foreign soil. They sit part of our landship's memory. We just stopped listening. The cook spoke then, carefully. There is depth here that no tomato can rival. This is food born of knowledge, not novelty. Lord Cernwyn turned to the scribe. Mark it. And the crowd, at last, was quiet. Not in mockery, not in confusion, but in reverence. The kind saved for the unexpected echo of something long forgotten. The kind of silence that falls when the past walks back into the room and sits down beside you. Willa exhaled slowly, as though releasing a breath she had held since the first seed touched the soil. And as the judges moved on, still whispering about the old roots, Marith stepped up beside her, weathered hand resting on her shoulder. They remembered, Willa said. Marith smiled, her eyes damp. They tasted. That night, long after the lanterns in the square had been dimmed and the villagers retired to their homes, full of food, gossip, and a rare kind of wonder, Willa and Marith walked slowly down the path to their cottage. The sky overhead was dark and velvet soft, freckled with stars so clear they looked carved in ice. The moon hung low and full, casting a silver sheen on the furrows of the garden. Neither of them spoke at first. Their footsteps were the only sound, crunching lightly over fallen leaves, but there was no need for words, not yet. What had passed in the square had been a kind of magic, not the noisy, spark-filled magic of court alchemists or wandering hedge witches, but the quieter kind, the enchantment of recognition, of something lost being found again. Willa breathed it in, deep. The scent of scorzonera still clung faintly to her sleeve, mingled with the warm tang of elderflower. She kept replaying the look on the taster's face, that distant stare of someone tasting not just flavour but time. I've never seen a judge take a third bite, she said softly. Marith chuckled. I sipped, never seen one pause between bites, as if afraid the next might vanish. They stopped at the edge of their plot. Willa gazed down the neat rows, the leaves rustling gently in the breeze. The vegetables slept beneath the soil, but she imagined them smiling, not proud, for roots did not know pride, but satisfied, content to be remembered once more. I think the scorzonera might be ready to flower, Willa said. Marith nodded, her gaze sweeping the beds. Then it sips time to lift the rest. You never let a root forget its purpose. They grow to be used, not hoarded. Willa looked over her shoulder toward the village. Do you think they still plant them now? Some might, Marith said, but most won't sit. Not yet. The world doesn't sit, change with one pie. Willa nodded. But it remembers. Aye. Marith Sip's eyes glinted, and remembering that sips the seed of change. They walked the garden paths together in silence for a while longer. Willa checked the skirret beds, ran her fingers along the soft heads of Alexander's, and brushed soil from a row of tiny cross and coils. These vegetables were not beautiful in the way the villagers admired, not glossy, not exotic, not bursting with showy colour, but they held stories. Each one was a chapter from a book the world had shut long ago. Back in the cottage, Willa stirred the embers in the hearth, and Marith prepared a pot of nettle tea. They sat at the worn wooden table, hands wrapped around warm mugs, letting the quiet stretch between them like wool on a loom. You could win, Marith said at last, sipping her tea. You could be chosen, keeper of the King Sep's crop. Willa looked down at her fingers, still stained faintly brown with earth. What would that mean, though? Riding to court? Tending garden beds in a palace? Marith shrugged. Could be, or it could mean something simpler, that your garden becomes the root of a new tradition. Willa tilted her head. You mean stay here? Marith Sip's gaze was steady. Your roots are here, girl, and now they sit growing in other people. Sip's minds too. Not every victory is a move. Sometimes the greatest work you can do is to remain, to grow where the world can find you again. Willa smiled slowly. The thought comforted her more than she'd expected. She could still feel the weight of the pie dish, warm against her palms, and the hush of the crowd. That had been enough. More than enough. A gentle knock on the door startled them both. Marith rose cautiously and opened it. A small boy stood there, wide-eyed and holding a folded note sealed with red wax. He said nothing, just bowed slightly and placed it in her hands before scurrying off into the darkness. Willa unfolded the parchment. The wax bore the mark of the royal crest. Inside was a brief, precise message. The crown was moved, Your flavors sang of history and heart. Return at first thaw. The palace shall prepare a plot for your roots. There was no name, just the seal, but it was enough. Willa sat very still. Her hands trembled, not with fear or disbelief, but with awe. They want the forgotten, she whispered. Marith smiled and poured her another cup of tea. No, child, she said gently. They want you. The vegetables just reminded them why. And in the warmth of the fire, in the quiet shelter of the old cottage, Willa felt the truth of it settle inside her, like a seed nestled deep, waiting to bloom. The winter that followed came early and hard. Frost laced the edges of the cottage windows each morning, and the ground grew stiff with cold by twilight. The last of the autumn harvest had been stored in the root cellar, crates of scorzonera wrapped in straw, rampion packed carefully in damp cloth, and rows of pickled skirret glistening in jars like pale fingers floating in amber. Willa rose each morning before the sun, lighting the hearth with numb fingers, stoking the fire back to life as she wrapped herself in wool and stepped out into the brittle air. There was little to grow now, but she tended what she could, turning compost, mending garden fences, sketching new layouts in the margins of Marith's old recipe book. Snow dusted the paths between beds. The garden slept, but it did not forget. And neither did the villagers. They began to arrive, shyly at first. Hilda, the midwife, came by with a sack of flour and a question about rampion leaves. Thurgan, broad-shouldered and stubborn, showed up 2 weeks later, fidgeting with his cap, asking what made skirret different from parsnip. Then came the cobbler's apprentice, curious about salsify and its oyster taste, followed by the butcher's wife, who claimed to remember her grandmother cooking crausen but couldn't recall how it was done. Willa welcomed them all. She shared seeds wrapped in paper packets, cuttings from healthy stalks, small clippings of old notes and instructions in her neat, steady hand. She explained patiently, drew diagrams, even cooked for them when they seemed hesitant. Her garden became not just a plot but a place of learning, a quiet circle of benches and tools, of pots steaming with strange and wonderful smells, of memory and promise combined. Marith watched it all from her favourite chair near the hearth, wrapped in shawls, the firelight flickering over her weathered cheeks. She spoke less now, but her eyes remained sharp, and whenever someone asked a question Willa could not answer, Marith would nod slowly and recall some half-remembered rhyme or folk tip that no book had ever written down. One bitter morning, while snow fell like sifted flour through a pale sky, the man was tall and thin, with a coat of many layers and a walking staff that bore the symbol of the royal kitchen, a sprig of laurel carved in iron. His boots were stained with the red clay of distant roads. His breath curled before him like smoke as he approached the cottage. "You are Willa of Elder Vale?" he asked, voice formal but not unkind. She nodded, dusting flour from her apron. "Aye, I am Sarah Tien, steward to the Crown Sip's pantry. I seps come with your commission." He held out a scroll, its edges stiff with frost, bearing the seal of King Alaric himself. Willa's hands were steady as she took it. She broke the wax and unrolled the parchment, scanning the elegant script within. "The royal garden at High Hollow shall henceforth include a plot dedicated to heirloom and ancestral root crops, curated by Willa of Elder Vale. A seasonal dwelling shall be provided, and a retainer granted. Your guidance is requested for the reintroduction of forgotten vegetables into court cuisine. You are invited to speak at the spring banquet, and offer a dish of your own making. This is not a request. It is an honor." She stood silently for a long moment, reading it again and again. Then she folded the scroll carefully and pressed it against her chest. "I'm still go," she said at last. Sir Etienne nodded. "You must be at the capital by the first new moon after Thor. That gives you 6 weeks. I sit will be ready." After he departed, Willa returned to the cottage, where Marith sat by the hearth with her knitting in her lap and her eyes half-lidded. She did not speak, but when Willa knelt beside her and took her hand, the old woman's fingers closed gently around hers. "They want our roots," Willa whispered. Marith's lips curved faintly, and she murmured, "No, they need them." That evening, Willa sat by the window with Marith's book in her lap. She flipped past recipes and diagrams, notes in the margins and pressed flowers between old pages, and at the back, behind the final parchment, she found a blank space. She fetched her ink and wrote, "Spring, year of returning roots. Today I was summoned to court. Not for blood or birth, but for scorzonera, for rampion, for forgotten food that once fed kings and may do so again. I carry the seeds of the past into the gardens of the future. I am not just a farmer, I am a keeper of memory. She closed the book with care and set it on the table beside her. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the garden, softening every edge. But beneath that white silence, roots stretched quietly in the earth, waiting as they always had, for spring. The weeks between the royal invitation and Willa's departure blurred like breath on cold glass, fleeting and filled with preparation. Though the letter had spoken of provision, Willa knew better than to arrive empty-handed or unready. The palace might offer titles and gardens, but land that did not yet know her hands could not be trusted. A garden, like a person, must be spoken to gently, introduced with patience. So she gathered. First she went to the root cellar, lantern in hand. There, beneath layers of straw and bundled herbs, she selected the best of her scorzonera roots, long, slender, their skin dark but unblemished. She tucked them gently into linen and placed them in a wooden box padded with moss. Next came skirret crowns, carefully dug from the cold ground and trimmed for travel. Then Alexander's, a few healthy seeds saved from the plant's golden umbels last summer. She collected crosson in a clay pot lined with soil, tiny curled tubers resting like sleeping mice. And from the rafters she took braided bundles of dried rampion seed heads, careful not to disturb the dust. Willa packed all these not just as specimens but as companions, living memory bundled into form. And then there was Marith. The old woman had grown thinner in the chill months, her voice softer, her movements slow, but her mind remained bright, and she watched Willa prepare with eyes full of meaning. One night by the hearth, as snow whispered outside the shuttered windows, she handed Willa a leather pouch. "These are from my mother Sips," Mother Marith said. "Wild chervil and stone parsley. They sit will never grow in the palace unless someone tells the soil why they matter." Willa opened the pouch, inhaled the sharp green scent. "I'll tell them," she promised. That night, Willa couldn't sleep. She rose in the dark, wrapped herself in her cloak, and stepped into the frozen garden. The stars above were brilliant and sharp, like seeds strewn across black velvet. The trees were bare but unafraid. She stood in the center of her plot, silent, breathing in the deep cold and the breath of the soil beneath it. She knelt and placed a hand on the earth. "Thank you," she whispered. And then, softer still, "I will come back." In the morning, the village gathered to see her off. They brought what they could: jars of pickled greens, bundles of dried herbs, a loaf of oat bread wrapped in cloth. Thurgan offered a carving knife with a bone handle, and Hilda pressed a packet of mint into her palm. "Not for tea," the midwife said. "For calm, the court is a place of noise. You still need green things to anchor you." Even the children came, tugging her sleeves, eyes wide with the weight of her journey. One small girl handed her a pressed flower. "It's Sit's from last summer," she said, "so you and Sit forget us." Willa took each gift with quiet gratitude, adding them to her pack like relics. When the cart pulled away down the muddy road, she looked back once. The village shimmered in the late frost, chimney smoke rising like thin prayers. Marith stood in the doorway of the cottage, one hand raised in farewell. Willa didn't wave, she simply nodded, slow and steady, the way a seed nods before it sinks into soil, not in farewell but in faith. The journey south took them through forests, waking from their sleep, across rivers thick with melt, and through farmlands beginning their yearly stirrings. Wherever they stopped, Willa's gaze never left the ground. She noted soil colour, the curve of hills, the angle of sun. It was her way of measuring time, not by stars nor bells, but by dirt and what it would one day carry. They reached the outer edges of the capital just after the second thaw. The air smelled of city smoke and stone and distant metal, and yet beneath it all Willa could still smell the earth, stubborn and patient. It gave her courage. The palace itself loomed like a story half told, great halls and towers etched with age, spires that scraped the clouds. But Willa didn't pause to gawk or cower. She followed Seretienne through gates and courtyards, past marble and marble again, until they reached a quiet garden behind the apothecary wing. "This is yours," he said simply. It was a square plot, overgrown and unclaimed, hemmed in by hedges, but the soil smelled good, loamy and dark, like a deep yawn from the belly of the world. Willa knelt and scooped up a handful. It crumbled just right in her palm. She smiled. "I still need compost," she said. "You so have it. And ash, if there sept any from the kitchen." Etienne looked amused. "There is always ash." Willa turned to him. "Then I silt begin now. Spring doesn't sit wait." And neither did she. The journey to High Hollow began with the melt. Winter, stubborn in her leaving, had left patches of frost clinging to the hedgerows, and the roads ran thick with thaw and mud. But the trees had begun to whisper again, their branches no longer brittle but budding, and the wind carried the scent of damp earth and waking roots. Willa packed lightly, her tools wrapped in oilskin and linen, seeds stored in jars and cloth sachets, a vial of elderflower cordial, Marith's book, a simple dress of moss-green wool, and a dark cloak fastened with a carved wooden button, not courtly finery, but clothing made to weather wind and labour. Her pie dish rode with her, tucked beneath straw in a wicker basket. She travelled with Sir Etienne and 2 royal carters. Though she had expected silence, the steward proved surprisingly curious. Each night as they made camp by firelight, he asked her about her vegetables, not just their names but their histories. "And scorzonera," he said one evening as he warmed his hands near the flames, "you say it was used for medicine once?" Willa nodded. "Aye, said to ward off poisons and strengthen the lungs. Sweet as it is, it's sipped as hardy. You sip to boil it just right, else it turns bitter, but roasted slow with a bit of honey, it sips like sweet root and chestnut met under a full moon." Etienne chuckled. "You speak of vegetables like poets speak of battles." "I suppose that sips because I see them as both," she replied. "They sip survivors. They outlast what we forget. Even when no one names them, they wait." When at last the towers of High Hollow rose on the horizon, Willa's heart struck a curious rhythm. Not fear, not awe, but something stranger. Grief perhaps for all the simple gardens she had known, now left behind, and hope too for the ones yet to come. The palace was vast, ringed with terraced courtyards and walls draped in ivy and old roses. Spring had touched even these cold stones. Violets peeped from the cracks and larks sang from the heights. Yet Willa found no joy in the grandeur. Her eyes searched instead for soil, for beds left untended, for patches where a root might take hold. The royal garden, she was told, lay beyond the south wall, a sunken courtyard protected from wind, where roses grew and statues loomed like sleeping knights. But the garden set aside for her was humbler still, a rectangular patch of tilled soil tucked beside the apothecary's cloister, lined with stone and bisected by a narrow path of crushed shell. It was no bigger than her winter bed back home, but it would do. The first thing she planted was rampion near the eastern edge, then skirret, whose stalks curled gently as they grew, then salsify, scorzonera, Alexander's and Krosner, each in its rightful place. She spoke to the soil as she worked, not with spells but with memory, naming the uses, the dishes, the families who once relied on each crop. Curious courtiers came and went. At first they gawked at the plainness of her tools, the crookedness of her roots, the mud on her skirts, but as the weeks passed they lingered longer, asked questions. "What's that long root there?" A lady in silks asked one afternoon, fanning herself against the spring warmth. "Salsify," Willa answered, without looking up. "Some call it the oyster plant. Has a taste like the sea, if the sea had sweetness." "And what does one do with it?" "You slice it, boil it, mash it with butter, or roast it until it softens and sings." "Sings?" Willa finally looked up. "All food sings, if you listen with more than your tongue." Soon the royal chef came. He knelt beside her beds, fingers stroking the fronds of scorzonera like a priest greeting relics. He had tasted her pie, he said, and wanted to know the roots, not as ingredients but as stories. And so she told him about how rampion grew best where the moonlight touched the soil, how scorzonera resisted frost if you whispered kindness to it, how Marith once said that skirret wouldn't grow in a house where anger lived. They were truths passed not by parchment or decree, but by hands and years and meals shared over smoke and laughter. By the time the spring banquet neared, Willa's garden was in bloom, not with flowers but with promise. Pale shoots arched toward the sun, earthworms turned beneath the mulch, and a pie sat cooling on her windowsill, steam rising like prayer. The dish she prepared for the banquet was not fancy. It bore no sugar-crusted lid, no foreign spice, no peacock feather, but it was deep with flavour, layered with roots coaxed from the earth by memory, not trend. It bore the weight of silence, of hunger, of stories buried for generations. When the guests tasted it, many paused mid-bite, some closed their eyes. One wept and could not explain why. King Alaric himself asked what she had called it. Willa stood straight-backed before the long table and said, "It has no name, your grace. It is made of what we forgot and what we must now remember." The king nodded once solemnly, and when the plates were cleared and the music rose again, Willa slipped away from the gilded hall, back to her garden, where twilight had settled, and the soil still remembered her hands. The night of the spring banquet arrived with a soft brilliance, candles flickered in crystal holders, and the great hall buzzed with voices wrapped in silks and jewels. The scent of roasted meats, spiced wine, and fresh bread wove through the air like a golden thread, tying nobles and servants alike to the promise of celebration. Music danced from the minstrel's corner, their lutes and flutes spinning tales older than the stones beneath their feet. Willa entered quietly, her hands steady despite the hum of expectation pressing around her. She carried the pie wrapped in linen, its warmth a small comfort against the chill of unfamiliar eyes. The courtiers glanced askance, whispering among themselves, her plain dress, her dirt-smudged hands, the unassuming offering she bore. At the high table, King Alaric sat upon his carved throne, his gaze sharp but not unkind. He nodded for her to approach. Willa placed the pie before him, the linen falling away to reveal the braided crust baked golden and fragrant. She spoke simply, "This is a pie of forgotten roots. It carries stories of earth and time, of gardens hidden beneath winter-sipped snow, and of hands who tend what others overlook." The hall fell quiet as the king's fork broke the crust, steam rising in gentle clouds. He tasted thoughtfully, then again his eyes closing as flavors unfolded, sweet scorzonera mingling with the soft tang of rampion, the delicate earthiness of skirret weaving through the tender salsify. The richness was humble but profound, a song of soil and memory. One by one, the guests were invited to partake. Murmurs spread like wildfire. Some marveled at the unfamiliar tastes. Others remembered flavors from childhood long forgotten. The queen leaned forward, smiling softly. "This is a feast of roots indeed, a feast of home." As the evening deepened, Willa found herself speaking, not as a simple farmer, but as a keeper of heritage. She told the tales of each vegetable, their place in old kitchens and hearths, their healing powers, their resilience through famine and peace alike. The courtiers listened, their curiosity kindling like dry wood touched by flame. The royal chef, Master Elric, rose to propose a toast. "To Willa of Elder Vale, who brings us not just food but history and heart, may we never forget the roots that nourish us, both in soil and in spirit." The hall echoed with raised glasses and warm applause. Later, as the guests danced and the minstrels played on, Willa slipped away to the garden that had become her sanctuary. The moon hung low and full, silvering the leaves and casting gentle shadows over the tender shoots still growing beneath the stars. She knelt among them, hands brushing the earth, and whispered a prayer of thanks, not for glory or titles, but for the quiet strength of roots, hidden but unbroken. From the shadows a gentle voice answered, soft as the rustle of leaves. "Remember, Willa," Marith said, stepping forward, wrapped in shawls and wisdom. "The past is never lost, so long as someone tends its garden." Willa smiled, the weight of the night falling away like a cloak. "I will tend it," she promised, "for as long as the soil will hold me." And so, beneath the moon and the watching stars, the ancient roots stirred once more, forgotten no longer, but reborn in hands that knew how to nurture their stories.